We're in progress, guys. This book that I have here is something that, and I'm not showing you the cover on purpose. I read this with my fourth graders last fall, and this was one of the books that caused like a great conversation in my classroom. It brought me back to that like childlike faith, understanding, and like, wow, God is so like, he crazy, like in the best way possible. And it's actually what our talk tonight was sparked by. So tonight we're going to talk about the God contest. Okay. And in an attempt to encourage childlikeness, we're going back to Sunday school and children's church. Our very true story tonight is from 1 Kings 18. And it's about the prophet Elijah and the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel. And so that's what this story is about. I'm not reading this to you tonight, but I did tell you I was taking you back to children's church, but not our children's church where we didn't have YouTube. I'm going to YouTube tonight, children's church in the year 2022. So Julia, you actually have that slide on there. This one, if you wouldn't mind playing it. Do you have sharing sound? She might need to share sound. Sorry, Julia. Oh, there you go.
Slapstick Theater. Elijah on Mount Carmel. This is Elijah.
Hey-o.
Elijah was a prophet in Israel during the reign of King Ahab. His job was to tell people what God wanted them to hear. This is King Ahab.
Whatever.
He came from a line of kings who did bad things, but King Ahab was the worst of them all. He led the Israelites to do evil things as well, and they turned away from God and started worshiping a fake god called Baal. God told Elijah to go speak with Ahab. Elijah told Ahab to bring all of Israel and the prophets of Baal to join him on Mount Carmel. So Ahab did as Elijah asked. Then Elijah stood in front of them and said, "If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal is God, then follow him." But the people were completely silent. Elijah called for 2 bulls and told the prophets of Baal that they could choose the one they wanted to sacrifice to Baal. They could put it on the altar, but not set fire to it. Elijah said, "I will prepare the other bull and lay it on the wood on the altar, but not set fire to it. Then call on the name of your God, and I will call on the name of the Lord. The God who answers by setting fire to the wood is the true God." And all the people agreed.
Yeah!
Elijah let the prophets of Baal go first.
All right, you first.
They prepared the sacrifice and called on the name of Baal from morning till noontime, shouting, "O Baal, answer us!" But there was no reply of any kind.
Hey!
Elijah began mocking them. "You'll have to shout louder. Perhaps he is away on a trip or is asleep and needs to be wakened." So they shouted louder and raved all afternoon until the evening. But still there was no sound, no reply, no response.
Everyone come here.
Then Elijah called to the people. They all crowded around him as he repaired the altar of God that had been torn down and dug a trench around the altar. Then he had some men pour water on the altar 3 times. Elijah walked up to the altar and prayed, "God, prove today that you are God in Israel and that I am your servant. Answer me so these people will know that you are God and that you have brought them back to yourself." Immediately, the fire of the Lord flashed down from heaven and burned up the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, and the dust. It even licked up all the water in the trench. And when all the people saw it, they fell face down on the ground and cried out, "The Lord, He is God! Yes, the Lord is God!"
Thanks for playing that, Julia. All right, do you guys get the score? I like to use these videos because it's quick and it's better than
They fell face
babbling on and on trying to explain the story to you. So question for you guys, and I actually want you guys to answer, not all at once, but one of you guys, or two of you guys answer. What do you think, like what would you say was the most impressive thing about Elijah in this story? In the God contest, what was the most impressive thing? For you personally, there's no right answer. I have my own personal answer, and I'm pretty sure it's not the godliest answer. But would anyone want to answer? Yes, faith. His faith.
His courage and boldness.
His courage and boldness. Wow, are you a pastor or something? Anybody else? Anything that stood out to you? You guys are so holy. My favorite thing, or the thing I was most impressed about, was Elijah taunting the prophets of Baal. I was like, wow, what a savage. He wanted to just, hey, think you didn't shout louder than that. I think that's hilarious. Anyways, there are a few things, like after hearing and reading about this story, there are a few things that kind of stood out to me that I observed, and so I think that it applies to us as well, especially in seeing how Elijah, this man of God that everyone knew about, King Ahab actually called him the troubler of Israel, because he kept like shaking the ground beneath their feet with all the wrong things that they knew they were doing. I don't know if you caught that, but Ahab was part of a long line of bad kings, and he was like one of the worst of them all. And so, Elijah would call him out, be like, yo, that's not good. And Ahab was like, you're messing up my life. You're the troubler of Israel now. And so I was like, I'm gonna back away slowly then. You know, he was on bad terms with Ahab's wife, Jezebel. And so, but anyway, one of the things that I observed about Elijah is that he knew who God was. And Julie, I think the point is up there. Elijah knew who God was. And that seems like, again, something so simple, but it's a profound truth. Elijah had a lot of God moments before this God contest where, one, he predicted the great drought that brought Ahab to his knees, literally, in realizing, Baal's actually not as powerful as we think he is because we're stuck in this drought. And they were trying to call on him, and he did nothing for them. Couldn't even bring fire in a dry place. Like, for me, that sounds like, wow, he must suck as a god. Additionally, he stayed with a woman and her son, and they had like very little rations at the time because, again, they were in a drought, so you couldn't grow anything. And so one of the God moments in Elijah's life was when he was staying with this woman and her son. The little rations that they had was enough to feed him and them two, which should have only fed like the two of them for like maybe 3 days or something. I'm guesstimating here. It ended up like holding them over for like days or like maybe like a week or two, and that was like unheard of because they only had so little, and they were feeding a grown woman, a grown man, and a little boy. And if you've seen a little boy eat, they can eat. And another one of the God moments just before this story, just before this God contest, and you can find it in 1 Kings 17, the little boy that he was staying with died, okay? And Elijah, through the power of God, was able to breathe life back into this little boy that died. And so in all these little God moments, Elijah was figuring out, like, okay, not that he didn't know before because he was a prophet, that's literally his calling in life, but he had all these moments to kind of give him a firmer grasp of the reality of God, which is that he is great, he's mighty, he is powerful, there's nothing too difficult for him. So if he can cause the land to be dry, if he can provide even in the middle of something that's barren, and if he could breathe life into something that has no life anymore, like that's, if there's any God to trust in, I think that's the guy. So he was able to confidently challenge the prophets of Baal because he knew who God was. Like, how would you go into like any challenge without like 100% believing in the thing that you're supposed to defend? Like, that just sounds like a not smart move. But Elijah went into that challenge knowing full well that God would show up. And so he was also able to confidently pose the question to the prophets of Baal and the people of Israel. He was like, well, how long are you guys gonna waver between two opinions? Like, if the Lord is God, follow him. If Baal is God, follow him. And for Elijah to ask that question, he was like, the answer is easy, obviously. For all the things that I've seen, for how I know God, the Lord is God. It's not Baal, this guy made out of gold that y'all fashioned out of your own hands. Anyway, we're gonna move on to 30. The next thing that I observed is that compared to the prophets of Baal, Elijah didn't need like theatrics to prove who God was or his might. He trusted that God would show up, which is the second. Thank you, Julia. All the way from San Pedro, California, everybody. So verses 28 and 29 shows the prophets of Baal being absolutely ridiculous in trying to get their god Baal to respond and to answer them, and it did nothing for them. So our video was a kid-friendly version, but I want to look at what the Bible says. And so, Advocate, since you're closest, I'm going to have you read verse 28.
1 Kings 18:28, and they cried aloud and cut themselves after their custom with swords and lances, until the blood gushed out.
Next verse, Julia, please. Go ahead, okay.
And as the day passed, they raved on until the time of the offering of the oblation. But there was no voice. No one answered. No one paid attention.
They raved on. And like back in the day, and I read this in my little archaeological study Bible when I was preparing for this tonight, like cutting themselves was like it's a pagan tradition, and they really believed that it would call on the power of their God to do something. Obviously, please happen to them because God is faith. But it's just like, for me, it's like, wow, that's so sad. No one answered you after you cut yourselves, after you danced around, and after you cried out. And like, when Elijah was like, I think you need to be louder, they got louder, like, and they did that for hours. So they're like bleeding everywhere, and they're like, they're calling out to their fake God. And I'm like, wow, that's pathetic. like that's awful. That just sounds really not smart. But in contrast, with Elijah trusting that God would show up anyway, God showed up, did he not? He showed up in a mighty and wonderful and powerful way. Even more so than Baal not showing up at all. God not only burned up the offering, but he burned up everything underneath it, including sucking up all the water that was there. Like, I think the estimation when they were studying it was like 12 gallons of water or something that was covering the altar, and all of it was gone, and the dust underneath it was all burned up. So it's like, you tell me if God is powerful or not. And Elijah didn't even have to cut himself. He didn't even have to dance around. He didn't have to cry, or he didn't even yell over and over and over again. And it kind of, which is funny, I'm kind of gonna go on a kid ADHD tangent here. When I was reading this story, I was immediately reminded of Psalm 51:16, and it's up there. Pastor, can you please read it for us? Julia, you have it?
Psalm 51:16. You do not delight in sacrifice, or it would burn it. You do not take pleasure in burnt offerings.
So this is the psalmist David, King David, who was king of Israel for a time. He was saying this about God, that he doesn't delight in sacrifice, or he doesn't take pleasure in burnt offerings. And I thought it was kind of funny that this was the verse that came to mind, because they're literally burning offerings in this story. But I have a point, and we're gonna get to it very soon. It's just like, when you look at what the prophets of Baal were doing versus what Elijah was doing, Elijah didn't really like sacrifice anything, nothing of himself. But again, we'll get to that. But then like Baal over here, the prophets of Baal over here were like cutting themselves, sacrificing themselves to make this sacrifice that they have on an altar burn up. And so anyway, it's ironic that I'm using this verse. They actually burn things, but this is the next observation and the last thing that I actually want to talk about tonight. Elijah knew that against God that there was no contest. Elijah knew that there was no one greater than Yahweh, and he raised the stakes in their little competition. All he asked was that they would build altars, put the little sacrifices on it, and then see which God would burn them up. And Elijah was like, no, I know my God. And I know that against him, there's no contest. So go ahead and pour all the water on it, pour all the water on it, enough to fill this little trench that I had to dig around it, because I just know, I know. And he didn't like flaunt that in their faces either. And it was because it wasn't just to show God off, like because Elijah's like, I don't need to do that. God can do that all on his own. But it was to show that this God, against whom there's no contest, is greatest amongst all of them. He knew that in the grand scheme of things, we're meant to trust and follow the great God, only God. And so verse 36 and 37 in 1 Kings 18, at the bell. Can you please read that? My family's all in the front. I keep calling on all my family members. Go ahead. So.
Kings 18:36. God in Israel, and that I am your
Oh,
servant.
Julia, can you go back one? Yeah, there you go.
And at the time of the offering of the oblation, Elijah the prophet came near and said, O Lord God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known this day that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant, and that I have done all these things at your word.
Next verse of the book, please. Julia, thank you.
Answer me, O Lord, answer me, that this people may know that you, O Lord, are God, and that you have turned their hearts back.
Thank you very much. You guys kind of get the idea of what Elijah's doing here? Did it say that he yelled it out? Did it say that he cut himself to make sure that his God would hear him? I don't know. I just thought it was crazy. Like there is no contest against this God, and so all these prophets of Baal are like, yeah, woo, like the wavy men, like this. Have you guys seen those? The wavy men in the street that inflate like that. Sorry, I have it in my brain because we had science night last night, and we were considering like putting our wavy guy out. And me and my coworker were like, no, we got it, and so we just like stood in the corner.
See,
I just did it. No, but I was just like in awe that Elijah knew exactly what to do. Again, because he knew God, trusted that God was going to show up. And he already knew that against God, there's no contest, you know? So in just asking him, that's all you have to do, because that's all we have to do for anything, right? If we want something from God, the Bible says, ask and you'll receive. And so that's exactly what Elijah did, knowing that that's who God is and that's in his nature. And because, I don't know if you guys noticed, his reasoning for doing all of this is that people would know that you, O Lord, are God, and that you have turned their hearts back to him. So one more thing before I move on. Did you guys notice that Elijah considered himself God's servant? In verse 36, will you go back a little bit, please? Maybe not. Is it? Nope.
The one before.
36. I think it's lagging a little bit. Okay, there. Came near unto the Lord God of Abraham and Isaac. Oh, let it be known that this day that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant, and that I have done all these things at your word. So I noticed about Elijah that he was really humble. You know, he was humble about who he was in the sight of God, and it wasn't like diminishing who he was, but he was there for a reason. He was there because God called him there. God wanted him to be there to like handle this whole God contest thing, and he knew that his power wasn't his. Like he knew. Going back to that reading in Psalm 51, Julia can go to the Psalm 51:17. Should be after that one. We'll get there eventually, guys. Okay, Julia, take your time because I'm almost done and there's a lot.
Sorry, I can't see the slides. That's why.
That's okay. Go more. Forward that way. Oh, you're all the way in the beginning. There. Wait. Ooh, go back. One. There. Yay. Okay. Gino, can you read this, please?
Psalm 51:17. My sacrifice, O God, is a broken spirit, broken and contrite heart. You, God, will not despise.
Thank you. I told you I had a point to go back to after the burnt offering verse. So like I read this verse and I'm just like, wow, what a great reminder that like even with all of the prophets of Baal and their yelling and their violent scratching of themselves or cutting of themselves and just seeing how Elijah responded, like he humbled himself enough to know that the Israelites were in need of God. And the Israelite people knew that before they had Ahab, but they just lost their way. And so Elijah, that was one of I guess I never really read this part of the Bible when I was reading through it, but just hearing his heart for these people, his heart was breaking for the people of Israel because he wanted them to know who God was. That he knew who God was, and he just wanted all these people to know also that, dude, there's this great God, and you keep putting him up next to this other idol. There's no contest. Why are you guys being blind about it? I prayed, when he prayed to God, he was like, God, show up so that people would know you, so that their hearts would turn back to you. And I just thought, wow, that's cool. And so that's why the Psalm 51:17 came to my head, and the Psalm 51:16. But going back to Elijah and how he responded to this whole situation, this whole God contest, the reason he brought it in the first place. He didn't need to do all of that violent and loud stuff to ask God to show up. He just humbled himself, and he just knew that God would show up. And it wasn't for a selfish reason to prove he was right. Sometimes we get into competitions and we're like, I just want to show you up. I just want to be right. And so that wasn't Elijah's intention. His intention was so that the Israelite people would come back to God, that they would know God again. And sometimes when I think about following God, I'm just some of the things he asks me to do is really scary. I know Ada can relate to this too, because sometimes she gets a word for people and she goes, I don't want to give them that word. But it's Elijah might have been scared, but he wasn't scared enough for the Bible to record that part. He just followed God in this calling, and it was so that these people, the Israelite people, would know God again, and that he would turn their hearts back to him. And so, how I think that this relates to us is, without realizing it, we have our own little God contests. Sometimes between God and the world, right? We see a lot of stuff on social media that gets very influencing, or in the news, and you're just your God contest is between God and the world. But most times, it's between God and us. What we think is right, how we think things should go. We choose between our way and God's way, and choose our way embarrassingly often, because we're not as humble as Elijah over there. I'm just kidding. We forget who God is. We don't trust that he's going to show up, whether we need him or we just would like him to show up. And we have our own little God contest, and we forget. Our bitterness, our desires, our thirst for justice sometimes, our anger, our self-righteousness. I'm going to read this list here because when I was writing this down, I was like, oh yeah, sometimes I make that my God. Our religion, our worries, our loved ones, our work, our needs, we keep choosing to prioritize these things over and over and over and over and over, unapologetically sometimes, and we make them our God. And but Baal, sometimes you're oh yeah, I would never be like the Israelites following a fake God. Wow, he's made out of gold. I would never. That's so dumb. No. But instead, we have all of these other little things that become our gods, and we put them up against God. And there really is no contest between our desires, our needs, our wants, our worries, our cares, any of that stuff, what we think is right. Up against God, there's no contest. And unfortunately, just like the Israelites, and just like I said, we forget. We always forget. We're forgetful people. We're humans, and our brain capacity is especially not as good anymore today with all the technology that's backed up by science. Y'all can look it up. We forget who our God is. And like the Israelites, sometimes we can't make up our minds about what God will hold our attention, or what God deserves our time, intentionally or not. It's easy for us to say, oh no, God deserves all of our time, and yet what are you giving me time to? So I don't know, for me, this hit me first when I was preparing. I was like, sometimes I'd be on my phone way too much. Sometimes I'd be on Netflix way too much. But sometimes we're those swaying ships that James mentions. People with divided faith are easily tossed and swayed by the winds and the seas, all of our cares and worries. But again, in a God contest against God, there's no contest. And I posed this question to my fourth graders: between Baal and Jesus, okay, these are fourth graders that were hearing this question. between Bale and Jesus, whose team do you think is worth being on? And I was trying to compare, like make it easier for them to understand, like between Captain America and Iron Man, who are you gonna side with? You know, that's what kind it is. And my most disruptive student, I will never forget him. His name is Benjamin Rizzo. I pray for him all the time because the little boy needs Jesus, that's for sure. But I love him to death, and he was just my most disruptive student. I think he I think he really needs the Lord and therapy. But he was the first one to answer when I posed this question. When I asked him, I was like, whose team do you think is worth being on? He was like, that's easy. There's no contest. Team Jesus. Easy for him to say. I was just like, okay, Benjamin. I was like, wow, there's hope for you yet, boy. And so to close, between the gods that run rampant and the God who is all-knowing, all-powerful, and who's everywhere always, what should one choose? What do you choose, right? And so I posed the question that ended this book in my hand. What will you decide? Because ultimately it's a choice. When like the Israelites had to choose to follow Baal or choose to believe in Baal, it wasn't just like, oh, Baal's here, I'm believing in him now. Like, no, it was an active decision that they made. They saw this created God, like man-made God, and they were like, oh yeah, I'm gonna follow that guy because I haven't heard from God in a while. And sometimes we can be like that. Like sometimes we don't sense that God is speaking, or sometimes we're just like, you know what, I kind of fell through the cracks. God doesn't really have anything to say about me or say to me. And so we fall through the cracks thinking about like, oh, you know what, because I don't hear from God, let me read this other book. I don't hear from God, let me just watch Netflix for a little bit, like instead of giving God more of my time reading the word and stuff like that. But I pray that we decide to be more like Elijah. This Elijah? Maybe. No. Elijah in the Bible. I pray that one, we know who God is. And I pray that we realize that we don't need God to show up in a theatrical way, that we would just trust that he is enough and that he will show up, because in the past, if you can remember, he has. He has always shown up, whether it was when you expected him to or when it was like most surprising and he was just like, surprise, change your life. I pray that we remember that, and this is the most important thing, I think. I pray that when we think about God and we think about all these other things that try to take our time, try to take our attention, that we would remember that if we put it up against God, that there's no contest. And I pray that, just like Benjamin Rizzo said, that we would just side with Jesus always. And that's it.
Well, Ryan has something to say.
All I'm saying is all these Bible studies after the first week. Getting better. Hey, that was first. You're getting us. Hey. I'm gonna keep myself in my back. That's it.
All right, we're all gonna stand. Oh, we're gonna close in prayer, but just again, I'm gonna repeat all the announcements. If you want to sponsor for food for this group on Wednesdays, please let my mom know. Church beautification on the 29th and friend day 16th.